Welcome back. This is the last day of Black Queer Town Hall in STEM, and we're excited to get started this morning because we have a special guest, Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, and her link will be over at Zoom. So if you haven't registered, please register within the next couple of minutes, and you'll receive the link, and then we'll hear her seminar, which is absolutely amazing. And I also wanted to say, just before we start, I feel like I'm already starting to introduce her, but I just enjoy her advocacy that she does around DEI, and also truly being I guess, a bibliophile of the literature, because a lot of times individuals that do DEI work are not really abreast of the type of knowledge that's needed to really encompass all types of cultural competence training. And the advice that she gives on Twitter is absolutely phenomenal in regards to the DEI work that can be done and the things that she's done in the past and the things that she's already written and that she will write. So I am a fan of Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein's work, and I'm just in awe that she was able to take her time to come and speak with us today. So thank you, everyone, and please tune in and listen to all of the fabulous talks. And we encourage you to stay through the whole programming for the last day, because we have special treats at the end for you. Thank you.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much, Chanda, for that amazing talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Eduardo Cotilla-Sanchez. He earned his PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Vermont. He is now an associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at Oregon State University. His lab works focuses on electrical infrastructure resilience and protection with a particular interest in outages. Outside of the lab, Dr. Cotilla-Sanchez is the president of the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, Oregon chapter, and the IEEE vice chair, aiming to do advocacy in cascading failures. He has also been heavily involved with the LGBTQ advocacy for Latinx individuals and those in engineering and beyond. Please welcome Dr. Eduardo Cotilla-Sanchez.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this Black Queer Town Hall. I am so humble to be with so many talented and distinguished speakers. My talk today is about our work in energy access. I'm Eduardo Cotilla-Sanchez, an associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at Oregon State University. The goal is to discuss a little bit about the work that we've been doing trying to integrate resilience and environmental justice in the field of power and energy systems. I would like to start with this quote from Ebony Omotola-McGee from the book Black, Brown, Bruised. Although biology, medicine, physics, and other STEM fields may lack the extreme people of color repelling qualities of engineering schools, the problems are rampant there too. As a relatively junior professor in the field, when I got into this power and energy systems discipline, I wanted to look at the history, what are the places where inequalities happens and learn why this happen. I think it's a really important portion of our job and allow for a more thoughtful integration of research with education. And I think that there is some agreement that engineering being the reference for essentially how bad can we do for people of color and this discipline is some sobering thought to put this work and many other works in context. More in particular with electrical engineering and queer lives and academia and electrical engineering. I like to start with this part from a paper, Managing by Not Managing, where they say that encounters with hegemonic masculinity, both prior to and during their engineering programs, appear to negatively affect the experience of openly gay engineering students, in addition to women engineering students. Faulkner in 2000 argued that the technical social binary was a reflection of hegemonic masculinity in engineering, helping engineering students dissolve this binary through increased emphasis on the social skills essential to engineering work, such as through group projects or increased opportunities for involvement in organizations who emphasize the value of collaboration to the field of engineering in relation to competition. So this is a part of the motivation for this work, trying to bring that particular aspect of power and energy engineering to have a more collaborative part of the work so that we can reduce this barrier for the next generation of engineering students and policymakers in energy access and justice. Sometimes when we look at the media and kind of the front end to what do we mean by energy access and justice, we start with green energy, and it has been since the late 2000s, after that recession, Recovery Act, and increasing investments in green energy and green jobs, and that's kind of the front end of what we see. I'd like to give a little bit of context to how do we connect this to the electrical engineering projects that are happening in the back end. So if we look at, first here, some of the divisions that in the United States grids, I have some other examples later that they are not from the US, so that we are not exclusively US centric when talking about this topic. But in the US, where we have 3 national grids that they are not synchronized between them. So we have the Western interconnection, we have the Eastern interconnection, and then we have Texas. So the first part of this analysis could be viewed as power system analysis, economics, and energy markets. So we look at the physics of how power is generated, transmitted, and distributed, and then we see how that is managed through economics and energy markets. Another aspect that our research group works on is in how to make this delivery reliable, resilient, and protected, so that it's safe for humans and for the environment. So you can see the difference here is, on the top, we have how to buy and sell power throughout the year. And then in the bottom part is, well, what happens if we have a really bad day and we're not able to reproduce that plan that we had to bring power. So even the divisions by which we are looking at the problem are different within the same power system. So you see that in the top, we have the different markets: Northwest, California, ISO, independent system operator, and different regions according to that market. In the bottom, we see that those regions, when we're looking at resilience, they are essentially clustered in different groups, and they report in different ways. So it is very tricky to make that connection with how to improve that energy access and justice. We do have a relatively stronger connection with power system analysis, but we don't have a very strong connection with the reliability, resilience, and protection aspect of energy access. So that second link here is the one that I would like to emphasize a little bit more today. So just to give some context here, this is from the International Energy Agency, Energy Poverty and How to Make Modern Energy Access Universal. This is a comparison of electricity consumption between the state of New York and sub-Saharan Africa, which we have the same consumption and a difference in population of 19.5 million in New York with respect to 791 million in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see the vast difference in consumption per capita. If we generalize this to the global aspect, then we can essentially report that out of the 1 billion people currently without access to electricity, 84% are in remote communities. So this is one of the main motivations for some of the work and research examples that we are discussing today. The first one here is a solution of using microgrids for energy access. To give a short definition, microgrids are a way to organize energy infrastructure to deliver electricity to users that can be happening in two ways, either in coordination with the regional bulk power grid, or being autonomous and harnessing local resources. In that definition of microgrid, we give the understanding that we can switch back and forth between those two modes of operation. So depending on how that resilience and economics are happening during a season or a weekday or a weekend day, we can either be active to the main grid or operate as a microgrid autonomously. So if we look at the United Nations Development Program for affordable and clean energy, there are some estimates that in order to provide energy for all in 2030, there's a recommendation that 50% of some of the recommended investments, they need to focus on microgrid infrastructures. So globally, that's a very stark picture of how much work we need to do. If we go back to the United States and in the middle of the COVID pandemic, there was this recent survey of household energy insecurity done by Indiana University in September 2020. It was a nationally representative sample of households at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. And this part of the survey was the second wave of a 4-wave panel. The survey has a margin of error of about 2%. So the first key takeaway of the survey was that 20% of the respondents indicated that they couldn't pay their energy bill. 14.5% received a shot of notice, and finally 6.5% had their service disconnected. If we zoom in into these numbers, we can see that the picture is even worse. 26.7% of Black and 27.4% of Hispanic respondents couldn't pay their energy bill. 19.2% of Black respondents and 26% of Hispanic reported receiving a disconnection notice. 8.2% of Black respondents and 14.4% of Hispanic households went on to be disconnected. Of course, the respondents that they categorize as other are also more energy insecure than white households, which had the lower rate there in that graph. So these are very specific of power and energy, but if we go back to the tenets of environmental justice and energy access, we can see that some of the issues that come up are common to other fields. So for example, the recognition justice, even though we're not right now on campus, would like to acknowledge that Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinefuban of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. So not having proper recognition justice translates into a lot of issues in power and energy access. The example here that I have is from the Sami community of Jilin-Narkit, that they were concerned about new wind energy plants that could disrupt the migration routes of the reindeer. And this has happened in several places where essentially there has been the engineering portion kind of descending into this design of some interconnection to the grid or some new infrastructure. And it has not taken into account the voices of the indigenous people, in this case of the North, or in different locations in the US as well. One of the projects that we have in Oregon State University with wave energy, it has been discussed extensively with the select tribes, for example, in the coast, to see how that integration could be done in a mode that is beneficial to all the stakeholders on the Oregon coast. Not only them, but also including fishing communities and how it would affect all the stakeholders in that region. Another example of one of the tenets, it would be procedural justice. This is from a paper in Energy Region Social Science in 2016. And they were looking at representation in different institutions for energy companies. And they found that from the executive teams on the Fortune 250, the headline essentially revealed that 84% were white male, in contrast to Black, Hispanic, Asian, and female representations. Things got worse when we looked at smaller companies, and then those proportions were even wider for the boards of smaller companies. So those are some of the aspects that that make the problem of energy access very tricky, all the way from the economics, the integration of green energy, all the way to resilience. So to start here with the first example that I wanted to show from our work and trying to look at resilience and see how we could quantify this aspect of power and energy access so that we can make a more just design of the power system. So in this work, we were looking at how to quantify resilience and trying to find what is the value of resilience. It is very tricky to find definitions of resilience and to assess the cost, because some of the most immediate definitions come from the context of power system protection. And power system protection are nonprofit operations. So it is a tricky calculation to determine that cost benefit and compare the value and the cost of improvement across different events, different contingencies, different populations. The framework that we were looking at is essentially, imagine that we have some event and we go from having a system that is going in optimal operation, we have an event, and then the resilience indicator says that we go into a disturbance, that phase one that we have in blue color there. And then during phase two, that green, we have a post-disturbance degree state. So imagine that we have an earthquake and it's affecting a population that disconnects that population from the grid. So then as we're doing a restoration of power, we will go into that phase three, that is that restorative state. So in that framework, we can essentially look at the cost as a resilience threshold, which is that dotted line that we have, that blue horizontal line. And it could be a cost, or it could be something that we have discussed before, that it could be a societal cost at different aspects of how to aggregate that cost. But that resilience threshold, once we cross it, we essentially say that we have an adaptive insufficiency area, which is that portion in red of the trapezoidal. And then the other green areas that we have in the bottom, they are those adaptive capacity areas, which means that we can be more flexible as we are improving that design with the community, so that we essentially don't have a very steep ascent to that distance, so that we can recover more quickly as well. So essentially we're trying to maximize that green area and minimize that red area. So the example here that we looked at is with a synthetic case of the Texas power grid, and that we modified. So this is from my former PhD student in my group, Felicia Cicilio, which is the first author in these two examples. And she took a synthesized part of the power system in Texas. So it is very difficult, so that we don't have to disclose true GPS location of transmission lines. So there were some researchers that have been working on synthetic grids. So they essentially map the population, and we can look at the map how it falls those transmission lines in some similar distribution of population that it would be on the real grid. And then she added some of the machine models that they are dynamic models for those renewable energy sources, for example, so that we can study what is the behavior after a fault. So we added some protection elements and some of the elements that will give us a good picture about resilience. So here, the event would be a very high impact event that simulates a hurricane passing through coastal Texas. So that hurricane in this scenario will essentially cause outages in 9 successive lines. So they would be essentially a disturbance of over 10 seconds, something like a cascading failure that goes and affects all of those lines. So one of the nice things here that we did in order to be able to cross correlate and go back to that collaboration that I mentioned at the beginning is that we will look for other groups to look at these cases and look at what's the impact of communities in the coast. So one of the things that we thought it was important, like we have here on the left, was to publish this modified data set adapted from a data set that other researchers had also already made open source. And we added this particular event and models for wind and the load and in this coastal event. And then we republished this adapted test case, also open access, so that hopefully some of the research group perhaps looking at that social impact on the coast could look at this transmission lines and see, okay, this is how we can do a restoration plan, right, for example. So I think going to that collaboration, that portion of sharing how we were working with that model in a way that it's clear in terms of the language for other disciplines, we think in our group that was super important to work with. Let's just show an example of what the model looks like inside. So this is just a very example of an aggregate distributed energy resource. So I apologize in advance for the messy slide, but this is kind of like what different controls we had to have for the wind turbine, and then we could have some storage and different treatments of frequency control. So if we were just discussing all of these parameters, it would be very hard to collaborate with other group. On the protection side, we use something that are relay coordination curves that are very much old school, and in a bad way in this case, where there are systems in the field called relays that are in charge of essentially trying to take out these transmission lines before they blow up, and they are coordinated so that they essentially disconnect equipment in the right order, and it's safe for the population connected to that transmission line or to that feeder or that equipment. So these coordination curves that we have with equipment in the field that has been out there for 40 or 50 years, once we do a new model, for example, if we do an integration of a wind farm or wave farm, we essentially had to coordinate the new equipment and protect it in a way that it's compatible with some of the old equipment. So it's a very tricky problem when you have equipment in the field that has been out there for 30, 40, or 50 years. And I teach my protection class in the winter term, and this is one of the parts that some of my students we discuss as being very tricky to bring new methodologies and new people to work on this problem when is kind of like we have a photocopy of a diagram on a manual of a relay that hasn't been open in 20 years, and now we are going to work on that transmission line. And that's one of the problems of that representation, of how do we work in a field that it's very specific, and it's been very, very close to any sort of collaboration. If I go in my school building upstairs and look at the students and the engineers that were working on diagrams like this at the time that they were produced in our power system program, then you can see that, for example, here, the class of 1971 was not very diverse, right? So it looks like kind of the same color of that diagram there on the left. So just to put that and abstract that, the way that we can do it with the language for our collaborators is saying, okay, we are gonna label this in ways in which you can assess different scenarios and say here 0% DER, distributed energy resources, as we are incremented that amount of distributed energy resources from a fixed percentage, or in this case in labels E, F, or G, some uncertain amount of distributed energy resources. This is how we can translate that to some of our policy making, or we can work with social scientists so we can abstract that calculation with that model that we had before. So we can always go and show some more detail and say, well, we have some assumptions that maybe are important. In this case, going back to that trapezoidal distribution of the definition of resilience that we have, we can say, well, we have that transient contingency when we have the hurricane and those faults that are happening in the transmission lines. And then the post-disturbance and restoration phase, in this case, we use the statistical metric because we have not modeled that with a dynamic model. So just to keep things honest and zoom in to the right amount of detail that we need to collaborate and make some impactful decisions that they are beneficial for the community that we are putting in this analysis and this exercise. Same thing with the different models. We can try to put it in ways that we compare some of the previous models, that they were steady state responses and dynamic responses, and look at those scenarios and say, look, in this case, the main event is that the variation that we have by including that dynamic response is bringing us over time over that threshold. And we can look at the time scale for having different operators react to that effect. Again, back to the different means of representation, the way that I summarized all of that analysis in the paper, for example, if one goes to Twitter and only has a certain number of characters to describe the takeaway from your paper, is just those 3 points there. Just be careful. There could be a 15% difference between dynamic and static models. If you add voltage support at different places, that's a really good idea. You can improve 4%. And then be careful with seasonality because that's very key, especially with wind, as we're integrating wind in that event. So just give those key takeaway so that you can perhaps find a collaboration with the so that was the first example. This second example is going back again to international and microgrid development for rural electrification. So in this example, also from Felicia's work and in collaboration with Matthew Oraz and Amy Muller, that they were with One Power Africa and Northeastern University. we worked on how to have an open access toolbox so that we can work on this problem of designing some microgrids that take into account all the inputs that we know from that local community. So we essentially put together two different pieces. The first one is related to the generation. So what is the load profile? What's the generation profile? And then we put it together into an algorithm that shows what is the levelized cost of electricity. So what is the overall cost normalized for all of that generation over the lifetime of those generation plants? And then given that distribution of that dispatch that we want to work on, the second part of this work was essentially trying to design and optimize what is the right pole placement given, for example, one of the villages in the region, so that we can improve the resilience on the actual transmission and distribution. So we have kind of like the portfolio of generation was part of the algorithm, and we combine that with what is the actual distribution of the infrastructure for our microgrid, so that we can have a sensible balance between that cost and the resilience. So we found, so the example here on the left was, for example, for a village, and we have the number of houses, just an example of what the input will be, the peak load of the village. They will have a battery of a given size. This place in Lesotho was also having some solar PV, and they had a propane generator. So those were some of the inputs. And then here on the right-hand side, the second part of the algorithm was the input to the algorithm, an image from Google Earth of the village in Lesotho of Hamakebe. And then we essentially went manually and look at exclusion zones. So this is something that you could work with the community and say, okay, this is, for example, going to be very close to a school. So you can essentially draw what are the places where you essentially are not going to be bringing infrastructure, because it could be very close to a hospital, it could be very close to a school, and they are not good location. It could be a sacred site, and they are not places where you would put infrastructure, migration of animals like we mentioned before. So after we have all of that information in collaboration with, for example, a group giving that input and putting that voice on the table, then we can go and run that analysis to create different levels of resilience. So the case, the solution case here for the Hamakebe network solution, going from left to right here, you can see how without increasing any extra resilience on the left, we will have a solution which will be the cheapest, we will see. And then as we increase some of the parameters for resilience, you can see on the 10%, and then as we go to the 25%, how that green line, the colors are different according to the voltage level, how it starts to close that loop, right? So that green line on top, it shows that as we increase the resilience, we essentially have more redundancy on some of the paths. And that, of course, is more expensive. So that way, we can figure out a way that we have resilience that it's good for that population, given a cost that is also going to be good for that population, because this power system equipment, like we mentioned earlier, is going to be very expensive to start with, and then it's going to be deployed for a long time in the field. So here, just an example on the table of how as we will increase that reliability, probability, the costs, the added costs of having those solutions like we have here in the back by adding those extra connections and extra lines, that will be quantified essentially, for example, here in dollars. So this is the second example that I wanted to show in terms of research of how to make this infrastructure something more accessible for all sorts of communities. going back to the teaching side, I wanted to show, this is my power systems class before COVID times, where one of the things that we did and towards the end of the fall term would be to go and visit some of the power system equipment that sometimes we might not pay a lot of attention to these big pieces of equipment, but they are bringing a lot of electricity to different places, and there's a lot of work of people and engineers behind. So one of the traditions that we have is to go and walk or bike, or some folks that could not do that also drive. So just to get to the substation near our campus and look at where power comes and goes. Of course, it's Oregon, so most of the time, traditionally, we will get a little bit of rain. And then the other aspect of this collaboration, also you can bring that to the research, is some of the field projects. So this is our collaboration with University of Alaska Fairbanks 2 or 3 years ago. And this is Felicia, who was the first author in this works before she graduated, and now she's a faculty member at University of Alaska Fairbanks. So I think it is important to perhaps establish those collaborations if you're able earlier, so that they are fruitful, and just try to show up and spend time with these communities that you're working with, and and hopefully when we go back, to be able to travel and spend time and engage with these communities, you can help out in ways that they are meaningful for the community. So this is where I am going to stop here. Thank you so much. I think we have a few extra minutes for discussion here in real time. So I'm looking forward to chatting a little bit more with all of you. And then if I don't get you here in real time, feel free to send me an email, or check our website for downloading some of the examples that we had, and also on Twitter. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Eduardo Cotilla-Sanchez. It was a fabulous talk, and I really appreciate all your advocacy that you've done within Oregon and also at Oregon State specifically as well. And thank you for all the work that you're going to do. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Anthony Ocampo. I've known Dr. Anthony Ocampo for a couple of years now. He is also a Ford Fellow like myself, and it's always nice to introduce another Ford Fellow awardee from the National Academy of Science. It's an honor to have this distinguished award. So first, before I introduce Dr. Anthony Ocampo formally, I'd like to give a little story about how I met him. So I met Dr. Anthony Ocampo from one of his talks that he gave at the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, where he serves as the director of campus workshops. And he was doing a set of programming for the actual PAI program that's in all of the Big Ten schools. And his talks were, I mean, just freaking amazing. And I really was inspired by the work that he was doing. He was also telling us about how it was a challenge to balance a family, also extended family, and then also being a professor of color, in addition to actually keeping up with the demands for tenure and everything. And it was really interesting to hear about his journey, in addition to his science that he was telling us about and his scholarship that he's creating for multiple faculty to be able to receive the right type of development so that they can be outstanding mentors. And so from the small nugget of this story, it was really good, and he was very calm. So he left a good lasting impression to me, and he's still the same, I can say, from his Twitter posts that he makes. So he's very much impressionable and says a lot of the same content that he says in person as well as on his Twitter. So now that you kind of know a little bit about the backstory of Dr. Anthony Ocampo, you would see why he's easily could be considered a champion of champions for the Asian community, and also for minorities just in general that make up the BIPSC diaspora. And so I just wanted to welcome him and say thank you for the work that you're doing. And everyone, I just want to tell you a quick little bit about him. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles. He is now an assistant professor of psychology and sociology at Cal Poly Pomona and a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Ocampo's work has focused on immigration, race, LGBTQ rights, and intersection of those three in American society. And notably, he's the author of a book called The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Race Rules, and is currently writing a second book to be Brown and Gay in LA. Please welcome Dr. Anthony Ocampo.
Hey everyone, I am so happy that I get to be in conversation with you today. I wish I could be in person, but of course this is the virtual world that we're living in, and so I'm gonna do my best. I know that we have a lot of events that are happening throughout these past few days, and it's very busy. I know the beginning of the year is very busy for all sorts of reasons, whether it's because of your work obligations or campus obligations. And so I understand that like time is a very scarce resource. And so I just want to remind folks that I just want to treat today as literally a conversation, as if, I was there next to you or in your presence, and we were just having a conversation about something that I think needs to get talked about a little bit more, particularly for folks that are, in academia, and who are Black and who are queer or people of color or all the above. So yeah, I mean, what I wanted to talk about today was, and literally this is the first thing I'm doing in the year 2021. I had a couple ideas for what I wanted to talk about, but up until the last minute, I think at the last minute I had some title like, reimagining the professoriate or something like that. But given that we've endured all the things that we've endured in 2020, and this is the beginning of 2021, I feel like I wanted to start with a very different message and decided to switch it up last minute. And so today, over the next 40 minutes or so, I just wanted to talk about the radical importance of being okay and being messy, because I do think that as folks that consider themselves to be high achieving, folks that are in graduate school, but folks that are also queer, Black, POC, trans. I think it's often the case that we're so tethered to the idea of being excellent because excellent has been a tool of survival. And just for a little bit of a moment in this safe space, I wanted to talk about why it's okay to be okay and how that can be a very radical idea. Disclaimer, this idea of being radically okay or messy, these are not things that I myself came up with. I'm very much influenced by writers and thinkers, theorists in Black feminism, creative writers, artists who've been more recently talking about this idea of being okay. So a note of introduction, my name is Anthony Ocampo. I'm an associate professor of sociology. Before I tell you a little bit about myself, I just wanted to share a couple thank yous, salamat, as we would say in Tagalog. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Hinton. I want to say thank you to Ryan Daniels. I wanted to thank you for this invitation, for being part of this great event. It's an honor. It's an honor to be in community with you, given all the many things that I'm sure you could be doing. And it's an honor to be part of it that grew out of this, creative genealogy. And I'm going to be talking about genealogy a lot today. This creative genealogy of thinkers and activists and performers like Bob the Drag Queen, Peppermint, musician Mitch Farino. I'm very aware of who they've had on their previous iterations of this event, most notably Angela Davis. And so I feel very humbled by the fact that I get to be part of this in some small way. So again, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. A note of introduction. I'm an academic. I live in the world of academia. If you know me from Twitter, I am someone that am very, very open about reading academia and just, critiquing academia, in part because academia has been like this double-edged sword. It's been a space where I've been able to be creative, but it's also a space that's also reminded me of my multiple marginalizations in society. So I also identify as queer. I'm a son of immigrants. My parents are from the Philippines. My area of expertise is sociology. Most specifically, I studied impact of race, gender, and sexuality, and how that affects the way people navigate institutional spaces, academic spaces, particularly in higher education. Beyond my day job of being a professor at Cal Poly Pomona, I'm also an academic director at this organization called the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. And so even though I myself am not in the STEM field, and so I know some of you are like, what does he have to share about anything? The good news is I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of STEM faculty, junior faculty, associate faculty, graduate students, many of whom have been, folks of color, women of color, queer folks of color. And so, I've had a lot of conversations about the ways that academia constrains our everyday lives, but also ways in which, we can think of creative solutions to usurp or maneuver around those obstacles. Beyond my academic credentials, I know that it's super important. It's often the case that in a space like this, we introduce ourselves based on our resume stuff. But, on a personal note, I'm someone that loves to write. I love to read. I love reading fiction. More recently, I love reading essay. Beyond that, I'm an avid Netflix binger, and I have a family, so I have a partner. I consider myself to be a decent friend, and below me, you can't see him, it's not in your view. I am also a proud owner of a rescue pup. So I only say those things because a lot of time when we do these academic talks, we're so often centralizing our academic credentials that we often don't give enough airtime to the actual people that we are. And so I just felt obligated to do that. So anyway, what I'm going to be talking about today is the things I'm going to talk about today with respect to being okay and being messy. These are things that are very much shaped by the year 2020, which is a year that I don't think any of us will ever have the chance to forget, even if we tried. That we're living in a we're living in a world where a country where 340,000 and counting Americans have died from the coronavirus. Deaths that didn't need to happen. Among that 340,000, there's been a large proportion of Black people, brown people who have been, whose already precarious situation with healthcare was already compromised. And so we know for a fact that people of color, Black people comprise a large contingent of those deaths. I'm Filipino, and I'm very aware that, you know, Filipinos are very present in the nursing profession. And it's been the case, statistics show that 1 in 3 nurses who's passed away from the coronavirus, it happens to be a Filipino nurse. I mean, we've seen stories of Dr. Susan Moore. We've seen stories of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. You know, a year ago, Breonna Taylor was writing Post-it notes, you know, planning out the rest of her life. And we all know what happened tragically with her. And so, you know, 2020 is a year that we won't forget for obvious reasons. Racial injustice, structural racism being called out, the continued attention on the Me Too movement. I mean, everything that's happening in Washington. It's been an incredibly tough year. And so I just feel the need to acknowledge that out loud. And, you know, people talk a lot about 2020 being a particularly tough year, but I mean, for queer people, Black people, people of color, we know that 2020 was not the beginning of the pain that has been experienced by society at large. If you look at the larger scope of American history from the perspective of people who are queer or who are Black or who are non-white, people of color, the experience that we're having in 2020 doesn't seem so much like an aberration. It almost feels like there's this genealogy of pain and suffering that's happened from the beginning of our society, despite the fact that this country has often framed itself as the land of opportunity, which is definitely something that has resonated with my parents when they first decided to move here, or you know, equal rights, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I think anyone that knows that when you look at that narrative from the perspective of folks who have been marginalized, the reality of those statements are often things that are not givens, and you know, are things that need to be strived for even till today. I think that from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, the suffering that is happening in this year is in some ways novel, but it's not new. It's just in a different form. For folks, Black folks, queer folks in academia, Black queer folks in academia, you know, when you hear stories of police brutality, when you hear stories of people being harassed when they were on campus, when you hear stories of microaggressions that happen in the profession, in offices, in boardrooms, and in classrooms, you know, these are the things that invariably have shaped your perspectives on why you're pursuing this career in the first place. But it's also the fact that folks with identities that are intersectional, and by intersectional, I mean folks that identify, who live on the intersection of Blackness and queerness, or womanhood, or transness. We also know that Black queer people in this country have been the site from which some of the most important intellectual innovations, social movement strategies have emerged. And so as much as it's important for us to acknowledge that in 2020 has been a year of pain, particularly for queer folks of color, I think it's also been important for me personally, just as a way to get through the day, to remember that some of the advances that have been made into society are all to do with Black queer people and Black trans people throughout recent history. So, you know, we know about folks like Angela Davis, Bayard Rustin, Barbara Smith, and the Barbara Smith, Audre Lorde, Laverne Cox. In this year that is, it's not even this year anymore, in this past year that has been so tough, I've often found myself indulging in the readings or the interviews of people like Angela Davis and Barbara Smith and Bayard Rustin, because as folks that have bared witness to a larger arc of history than I have at my age, it feels so necessary to hear what wisdom they have to impart. And so in a lot of ways, the folks that are listening, all of you, I want you to think, even if your names aren't as famous as these folks, in the context of the work that you do, you are very much so a part of this genealogy that is fighting so hard to make the world a better place. And I think that for myself as a queer person of color, I think of the irony of like the fact that I spent much of my life in my own head and alone because I was queer, because I was Filipino, because I was non-white living in a white world, that it was really, really hard to think of myself as something that was part of something larger. And so what has been keeping me going, what kept me going in 2020 is the fact that I felt like, even though I'm not Black myself, I felt like I was part of the genealogy of resistance that Black queer people have implemented in this society. So, you know, I'm a sociologist, and I've been someone that's been influenced in my work is on Filipino Americans, Latinx folks. My most recent book that I'm working on is about queer people of queer young men of color of Latinx and Filipino descent, growing up in LA. But, you know, when I think about my like intellectual trajectory, a lot of it, and I know this is the case for a lot of you in the STEM fields as well, a lot of it has been really shaped by the intellectual, activist, and community contributions of Black women. For me, I think of someone like Imani Perry, who's a scholar from Princeton, not in sociology, she's in African American studies, whose work, whose writing, whose meditations have provided much of the like intellectual scaffolding or theoretical framework for how I approach my work. And in her most recent book, Breathe, which is a short book, it's a letter to her young sons, she's writing about her experience of what it was like to grow up as a Black woman in the South, what it means to be a Black person, what it means to be a Black man for her sons, what it means to be raising Black children in the society that we live in. And so I was very much influenced by this question she asked in the book, which is something that I think will resonate with a lot of you here, which is how do you be in a world bent on you not becoming? I think it's been the case that if you reflect back on all the different experiences that you've had, from your family life to your neighborhood life to your school life, there's been so many messages that have hinted the idea that, you know, being a Black person, being a person of color, being a queer or trans person, being even questioning or bisexual, these are things that are not optimal identities. For a lot of spaces in society, we get the message that these are not optimal identities. And even for me, as someone that grew up in a very strong Filipino community and family, as a queer person, those weren't necessarily always safe spaces for me, just by virtue of the fact of me being Filipino myself. And so I think that there's constant messages around us that tell us that there's something lacking about what it means to be non-white or non-straight. And I think that when I think about like why I'm so drawn to the work of Black feminists is that Black feminists try to flip the script. And instead of trying to see like these intersectional identities, yes, these are intersectional identities that facilitate marginalization on the one hand, but these are also spaces in which there's a lot to be learned, and not just for the folks that fit into those categories. There's a lot to be learned for society as a whole, for educators, for scientists. There's so much to be learned. And so, you know, I wanted to share a little bit of the research findings that for my book that I think are relevant for the conversation that we're having here. As folks who are people of color, as folks who are queer, you know, these are the stories that I wanted to center in the writing of my next book, which for you know, just FYI is entitled Brown and Gay in LA, Queer Sons of Immigrants Coming of Age. And the reason that I wanted to center these stories, it just wasn't about just trying to fill a gap about stories that I felt weren't being told. Of course, that was part of it, but I really felt, as someone that embodied these identities myself, there was so much wisdom to be gathered from tapping into, honing in on those experiences. And one of the things that I've learned in the course of my research, of having interviewed many queer sons of immigrants of Latinx and Filipino descent, from reading books and essays and articles from Black and brown queer people in all different spaces of society, one of the things that has become really clear is that there is this tendency to overproduce, to be the super person, the super, you know, the super friend, the super partner, the super educator, the super teacher, the super scholar. There's just been this tendency to overproduce, this idea of like, if I just get this grade, or if I just get this degree, or if I just get into this grad school, if I just get this job, then somehow that feeling of worthiness that was not given to me because I'm a person with intersectional identities, that feeling of worthiness will somehow happen. And yes, on the one hand, I've seen in my research how, you know, doing well in school, aspiring to, you know, a particular type of career, yes, on the one hand, those are things that when you point, that help you advance, help you get out of a bad situation, that help you escape a heteronormative environment that feels so stifling. It's been many the case that education has been an avenue for folks to get out, but everything is a double-edged sword. And so the situation with education, even though it has become a form of survival for many Black and brown queer folks, it's also the case that every time that you work under that model of like, if I just get this grade, if I just get this degree, if I just get into this grad school, the issue is that it instills this idea that acceptance from others is at best conditional. And it instills this idea. One of the things that came out so much in my research is that it instills this idea that our worthiness is something that we have to fight for. Our value is something that we have to fight for. It totally goes against the idea that we are inherently, no matter what work we produce, or the way we act, or the way we dress, or how respectable we come off, it goes against the idea that like, we are worthy people regardless of those things. And so that was, on the one hand, really comforting, because in a lot of ways, that was something that I did in my life. I'm sure for a lot of you, you're all in, you know, pursuing careers in science. To some extent, that might resonate with you. But I think that there's something that has to be, that there's a critique there that has to be made, that like, we have to think of ourselves as people of value and worthiness independent of our labor. Like, our labor should not determine how we feel about ourselves, because the moment that something happens, and 2020 has been the year when a lot of things have happened, we can't be in a position where we're unable to produce, and then all of a sudden our feelings of value and self-worth have somehow subsided. And trust me, I have been guilty of being that person that has been unable to be productive this year in the ways that I've been before. And all of a sudden felt like my value, intellectually, I knew that my value as a person mattered, but like emotionally and psychologically, it just, something was happening. And I guess that's why you go to therapy, right? So yeah. And I think like the other thing that I also gathered from my research that has helped me to reshape the idea that like our queerness or our ethnic and racial identities are somehow disadvantages is that, what I witnessed in listening to the stories of and reading the stories of Black and brown queer folks and trans folks, it's that from these perspectives, of course, there emerges resilience and resistance, but from those spaces, we also get intellectual insight, intellectual creativity, intellectual innovation. We get art. We get brilliant writing. We get music, and not only that. When I think about one particular Black feminist whose work has been changing the larger conversation around academia, Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, in a lot of ways, and this is something that she says, these perspectives, Black women perspectives is who she's talking about here. They provide a blueprint to understanding the mechanisms of inequality that keep our society from what it can become. In other words, if you want to understand how inequality works on a structural level, on a cultural level, and a social interaction level, all you got to do is tap into the experiences of folks that hold multiple marginalized identities. In the case of her work, she's talking about Black women. In the case of this community here, it's, a question that I would pose to you is just to ask yourself, how much energy have I expended in trying to prove myself in the field of STEM? And when you answer that question, the answer, it's daunting how much energy that is expended, how much time is expended on one having to prove themselves when there's a sea of white folks who are just granted access based off potential or legacy networks. And so I want you to think about how, instead of framing your careers in that way, I want you to think about the question about how has being Black and queer or trans, how have those, like what intellectual insights, creativity, innovations have emerged from those identities and those experiences, not just in academia, but in the outside world as well. And think about the ways in which you can form community around folks that are there to center those unique intellectual insights that you have. I know that in the context of a lab or STEM department, physics department, a biochem department, that is going to be incredibly difficult because it's often the case that you may be the only one in your department. But here's the beautiful thing about folks that are, queer folks will understand this, especially. We are no stranger to have lived our lives in creative ways. And I remember as a kid how much my queer life was anchored in the internet, because in my real life, it was just impossible to be openly queer. And so, in a lot of ways, I think of social media, Twitter, this virtual format that we have now as being a very organically congruent space for folks that are queer people of color, because we're used to having to be innovative about the way we build community. And so, that's one of the things that I hope folks can do with this event, is that even though we're not with each other in person, we can think about the ways in which this event is an important stepping stone or catalyst for creating the community that we don't necessarily have in our academic spaces or our labs. Um, I want to talk about how, the other underbelly of this constant pressure to be excellent is that we often are so used to being on the grind as a way to chase whatever, you know, worthiness, proving oneself, trying to show folks that we're capable of doing things, when in fact they should already know that we're capable of things. It's incredible what happens even at the highest levels of not just in like tech, STEM and academia, but I think about the story of what's happening in Google, about Black women coders and computer scientists being sidelined, fired, etc. And amidst these conversations, I've been noticing that there's, whether it's on Twitter or wherever, there's this sort of impulse to like demonstrate that like what happened to someone, microaggression or an explicit racial aggression, what happened was, these are unjustified because, I have this particular degree, or, it often goes back to that question of like, what are your credentials? And while that work is happening, I think one of the things that we forget is that we are human beings as well. And so I think about how in the year 2020, I've been much more anchored to, this very, very well-known quote of Audre Lorde, who talks about how caring for myself is, especially for marginalized folks. Like, I know that caring for oneself can get a bad rap as like, oh, this is like this like granola self-help stuff. But for Black folks, queer folks, brown folks, trans folks of color, caring for myself is, as Audre Lorde hints, is a radical act in and of itself. She says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And Audre Lorde, very prolific thinker, queer, lesbian, Black woman, writer, poet, very much someone that influenced another thinker that has influenced me by the name of Roxane Gay, Dr. Roxane Gay, who wrote a famous book called Bad Feminist, which some of you might be familiar with. But, as cliche as it sounds, the idea that Audre Lorde introduced that I think has been taken up by Roxane Gay in her writings is that, folks that are on the margins don't often give ourselves the opportunity to be messy. It's almost as if we need to, constantly produce and showcase our excellence because it's our only way to survive. And I think what I appreciated from Dr. Gay's book, Bad Feminist, is that she talks about the importance of embracing that we are human and therefore we are messy. And I've often thought about how embracing being okay or embracing carrying yourself, embracing messy on the surface may seem like an indulgent act or selfish. But in reality, it's just a way for us to embrace the full spectrum of our humanity. And so that's another message that I want to leave with folks today, is I want you to think about the ways in which you can find either family, friends, other forms of community in which you have the room to be yourself, independent of, whatever front stage stuff that has to go on in your job. In an ideal world, given that at some point folks will be in positions of power one day, in fact, you're already in positions of power as folks that are scholars in your respective fields. Think about the ways in which you can create community where, that authentic version of yourself doesn't have to be checked in at the door. And so before closing out, I just want to leave you with something that really has this interview that I heard recently. It was a podcast interview conducted by A24, it was a film company, where they had a Black queer writer and a Vietnamese queer writer, Brian Washington, who's on the left. He wrote this incredible book called Memorial this year. Please check it out. And Ocean Vuong, who wrote a book called On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And I just want to read two quotes that came out of that conversation between them that I hope that you take with you moving forward. The first one's going to be from Ocean. So in the spirit of thinking about queerness as something that's not an inherent disadvantage, I love what Ocean said here when he said, queerness in a way saved my life. Often we see queerness as a deprivation, but when I look at my life, I saw that queerness demanded an alternative innovation for me. I had to make alternative routes. It made me curious. It made me ask, this is not enough for me because there's nothing here for me. And at some point he segues into talking about Brian Washington's book. Part of the reason they're on this podcast is because their books on queer POC life are being turned into films or limited series. And, you know, for me, that's incredible to see because I never got to see myself on screen. So, but one of the notable things about these books is that they're trying to go against this idea that our worthiness and value is something that we have to earn. And the way they do that, and this gets back to the title of this talk, is that they want to encourage this idea, what Ocean calls radical okayness. He said, I often talk about this notion of what I think is radical okayness, which is where I hope queer narratives can move forward towards, which is not the hyperbolic triumph or travesty, but a radical new realization of being okay. And I guess, you know, since we're not in person, I guess that's a question I want to leave you with. Thinking about where you're sitting in this moment right now, what would it mean for you to be okay being okay? Does it make you uncomfortable? Does it make you get edgy? If it does make you feel edgy or uncomfortable, why does it make you feel uncomfortable? Is there a way for you to pick the human beings in your social circle in such a way, or structure your day in such a way where being okay can be like the central goal of your everyday life, instead of that constant need to chase whatever miscellaneous thing you're chasing this time? For me, I literally have, I mean, you can't see it here, but I posted on my wall, I have this guiding question that I hope is my guiding question for 2021 that says, what am I doing to protect my physical health, mental health, and personal relationships? Sorry, I hit the mic. Again, what am I doing to protect my physical health, mental health, and personal relationships? And so going into each day, I've been so used to, for decades, I can't even remember how long, so used to centering my academic identity, my career, at the expense of all these things, my health, my relationships. And so for me, 2021's about how to center my health, physical, mental, as well as my relationships. And I want to leave you with, you know, Brian Washington, a quote from him that I think is something that I want all of you to take with you today, which is what he says here, this insight he had. He says there's a one-to-one correlation between the expansiveness of what I view as possible and my queerness. My queerness wasn't an impediment. It opened me up to the world outside of the worlds that I couldn't even imagine. Like I did not even know what I didn't know. That felt and feels like such a gift. And so I want to close where I started, which is again, a thank you, salamat. I'm really excited to hear your feedback and questions. You know, I truth be told, I was very nervous about having to give this talk. I feel like in 2020, I felt the pressure to say something profound, and I guess I wanted to just release myself of that pressure and model the message that I have here, which is, it is incredibly radical to embrace being okay. And so I just want to say again, thank you, salamat. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you for having me part of this. And yeah, I can't wait to hear from you over social media, Twitter, in the comments, whatever. Thank you so much for spending the day with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. That was such an incredible talk. Our last speakers of the town hall are two exceptional senior graduate students. Devin Swiner is an analytical chemistry PhD candidate at Ohio State University, where she is using cellulose to develop a new ionization source for mass spectrometry in various applications. Outside the lab, she has been a mentor to many students, chapter president of the Ohio State University National Organization of the Professional Advancement for Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers, the chapter vice president of OSU Black Graduate and Professional Student Caucus. She has also co-founded #MaxScientists and #BlackandChem. Samantha Mensah is a PhD candidate in materials chemistry at UCLA. She is also an NSF/GRFP fellow and also co-founded #BlackandChem. Additionally, she has taken that further to co-develop an initiative at UCLA with #BlackandChem to endow a lectureship series that will highlight Black excellence in research. You can support this initiative by going to blackandchem.com. Please welcome future Drs. Samantha Mensah and Devin Swiner.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Swiner, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in analytical chemistry at The Ohio State University, working under Dr. Abraham Badu-Tawia. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work titled Development of Thread Spray Ionization for Clinical Diagnostics. When you take a clinical sample, you can do one of two things with it. You can either let it undergo point of care testing. So these are your at-home tests. So think about a pregnancy test, or even for diabetes with glucose monitoring. Those are your point of care testing tools. Or conversely, you can go to a centralized laboratory. So that mimics the scenario where you go to the doctor to get your blood drawn, to do a full blood workup. Regardless, you have different priorities for a point of care testing versus a centralized laboratory testing methodologies. For point of care testings, you're thinking about direct analysis, but also miniaturization. How can we make these tests very easy and user-friendly for at-home use? And how can we do that in a way that can directly analyze a clinical sample? For a centralized laboratory, so your doctor's office scenario, you're thinking automation as well as direct analysis and multiplexing. So this means how fast can we analyze a lot of samples? How many tests can we get done with this one sample? But also, can we use one sample for multiple things? Regardless, you're trying to reduce the turnaround time. You're trying to find ways to make it easy to do, but also for the data analysis to be done very quickly in order to get these results back to the patients. Because the quicker we can do that, the more improved our engagement and treatment protocols can be for diagnostic purposes. My work focuses on the direct analysis step. So can we take a clinical sample, not have to do a lot of sample preparation with it, and directly analyze it to give us some indication of health and disease? Typically, how we do this in my lab is through mass spectrometry. And mass spec is really great because it is an analytical tool that's sensitive. It's also specific. You can get quantification out of it as well. And this is just a picture of the mass spec that I use for all of my work. I use a Thermo Finnegan linear ion trap. So it's a lower resolution instrument, but it's really good for small molecule analysis, and it's really robust. Traditionally, when you think about using mass spec for clinical applications, you probably are thinking of a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry workflow. And this is in general what that looks like. You do sample collection, so whether it's from mouse or from humans, you would do some form of sample preparation. So typically you would take a blood sample, spin it down to serum or plasma. You let it undergo chromatographic separation, get your mass spectrum, do your data analysis for your results. So that's one way you can do that. What my lab is doing is using what's called ambient ionization mass spectrometry to do clinical diagnostics. So this describes a class of techniques where you do the sampling and the ionization outside of the mass spec. You have various sources for ionizing agents. It's compatible with raw sample analysis, and it's also very fast. So if you want to think about the traditional LC workflow, you have a few hours of sample preparation, a couple hours for the separation step, but the mass spec is the quick step. With ambient ionization methods, this pictured here is desorption electrospray. So it is the first ambient ionization method that was created, but this is really fast. So you can do this in about 1 to 2 minutes, and it's really effective because you kind of cut down on a lot of the sample preparation and chromatographic separation steps. A subclass of ambient ionization methods, and where my research is housed, is called a substrate-based ambient ionization mass spectrometry. And this is really important because you can do collection, storage, and the mass spec analysis all from one substrate. You can look at solid samples and liquid samples. You have minimal to no sample preparation, and you get this generation of ions from the tips of these substrates, which is really important to mimic the traditional electrospray process. And whereas some ambient ionization methods require gas, the substrate methods do not. So what does this look like in practice? You can take any part of the population, collect any type of sample, whether it's blood, urine, a tissue sample, and use any one of these media to do this ionization for you. So the substrate methods in this diagram here are either paper spray, you can use cotton swab, so a Q-tip, which is really effective. My work, we're using a single piece of thread to do ambient ionization. Now you might be wondering, well, why are you using thread? So thread has a natural sharp tip. And by sharp tip, we mean if you take a spool of thread or even fabric thread and you pull a piece of thread from that fabric, it's really thin in diameter. And we can take advantage of that because it's small enough to mimic the sharp tips of electrospray. Thread's also widely available. I bought my spooled cotton thread at a fabric store here in Columbus, and that's the same spool of thread that I have been using. And because I use cotton thread that is made of cellulose, we have functionalization capabilities. So the surface of the cellulose material have surface hydroxyl groups that can do chemistry. So we take advantage of this, and I'll talk a little bit about this today. And also, it's very easy to use in practice. So you might be wondering, well, what could you do thread spray with? Essentially, myself and my colleague, Sierra Jackson, we took the most common applications for analytical chemistry and split them between the two. So I've looked at illicit drugs. Dr. Jackson has looked at hemoglobin analysis. She's also looked at pepper spray and pepper fruits for food science applications. We've done environmental work. So she looked at pesticides. I've also looked at ricin and some of its small molecule metabolites. And we also have looked at the omics. So we've done some lipid and fatty acid work, but also some metabolomics for disease diagnosis. And this is essentially what this schematic looks like, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the story we're going to talk about today is my first project, and this is a work I did screening illicit drugs in blood samples. So similar to how you can couple LC to mass spec, there are two traditional modes of doing that. So two ionization mechanisms that you can adopt. You can either adopt a very traditional electrospray-based mechanism, which is good for high polarity analytes, or an atmospheric pressure-based mechanism, which is good for low polarity analytes. And essentially for thread spray, they look the same. You take a piece of thread, house it inside of a glass capillary, you add appropriate solvent and voltage, and you get this generation of ions from the tip. The only difference between these two methods, so whether it's ESI-based or APCI-based, is the type of solvent that you use. But we're gonna focus on the electrospray-based mechanism for this project. So one of the things that I wanted to investigate were what things or what parameters affect ionization efficiency. So there's two sets of data here. The first set at the top are these pure solution samples. So this is with cocaine, so that's N by Z 304. And I did this at 100 ppb, so relatively low concentration that's also therapeutically relevant. And I also looked at it, cocaine in blood. So you might also be wondering what these untreated 30-minute and 60-minute treated refer to, and this is the type or level of hydrophobicity of the thread surface. So untreated threads, so cellulose is hydrophilic in nature, so that's what these untreated spectra are. Cut the thread from the spool and spray cocaine solution outright. This 30-minute mimics this intermediate level of hydrophilicity, and then this 60-minute is completely hydrophobic surface on the cotton thread. So there are a few things that I want you to pay attention to. So first, you can see the difference in ionization efficiency as the thread becomes more hydrophobic. So we always increase by an order of magnitude. And the transition that I'm monitoring here is this 304 to 182. So this is great because this is telling us that the more hydrophobic the thread is, the better sensitivity that we get. Now, this is not to say that the hydrophilic thread isn't good, because this is still really good signal for hydrophilic thread. But you get added sensitivity as you make the thread surface more hydrophobic. And this is because thread is absorbent. And if you have a surface that's hydrophobic, the things that you don't want, so the more hydrophilic parts of your sample are going to absorb into the thread, but something that's hydrophilic like cocaine will stay on the surface of the thread, which means your spray solvent has more access to it. So that accounts for these different levels of ionization efficiency for the non-biofluid samples. We see the same phenomenon with the blood samples. And as you can see, these tandem mass spectra data are noisier, and that is because this is in blood, and blood's a very complex matrix. So we were already expecting a difference in ionization efficiency from the non-biofluid samples to our blood samples, but we still get this increase in ionization efficiency by an order of magnitude as you create a more hydrophobic surface, which we do take advantage of. Because we get this increased level of sensitivity, we wanted to quantify that. So we looked at 4 different drugs on the 3 substrates in blood to see what our limits of detection and quantification were. And as you can see from this table here, we do get PPT, so parts per trillion or picograms per milliliter concentrations for the 60-minute threads. Now, the untreated thread, you still get 130 maximum PPT concentration, so it is still very sensitive. You just get added benefits of the hydrophobic thread. And because we noticed that this was so low, we wanted to see if we could get sensitivities lower than the PPT range. And I looked at diazepam in blood and was able to get a lower limit of detection of 25 femtogram per milliliter. So that means that we can use these hydrophobic threads to do trace drug analysis in a matrix as complex as blood. We then wanted to apply it to a real world sample. And what we did was we used agarose beads. So I got these beads from Dr. Amanda Hummond's lab here at Ohio State. They use these beads to grow spheroids in their lab, but we wanted to use the beads to mimic tissue applications. So what this looked like was I got a 96 well plate full of these agarose beads. So this is just a picture of what a healthy or viable bead looks like. And this is a non-viable bead. And the 96 well plate already had media in it. I got excess media from that lab and I doped that media with 100 ppb of diazepam. I took the media from the well plate, added the drug doped media to the well plate and let that infuse overnight and then sampled it with thread spray. So I used a 60-minute treated thread because we know that's the most sensitive of our 3 substrates, and just push a needle and thread through the agarose bead. And that would leave little pieces of bead deposited on the tip of the thread. And as you can see here, we get a very clean tandem mass spectrum of diazepam, confirming that we can do this agarose bead doping and sampling using thread spray. We took it a step further and wanted to see how stable it was. So the first part of the workflow was still the same. I let it infuse overnight with the drug dope media. And then what I did for the next 4 weeks was I removed that drug dope media and stored it in the oven at physiological temperature and sampled it via thread spray. So we know that it's sensitive enough to see differences in concentrations, as you can see in this graph right here. And then we wanted to see if that was stable. So if we could force the agarose beads to degrade, can we still see small levels or trace levels of diazepam? And as this graph shows you, yes, we can, which is really exciting for us, so that even though we get sample degradation at about 3 weeks, so this is just a picture of what a bead looks like without having nutrients for that long, it's still sensitive enough to detect levels of diazepam, even despite, this non-viability of our substrate. So with that, I hope I was able to convince you that we can use thread for small molecule detection and that this hydrophobic thread minimizes matrix effects and also increases our ionization efficiency. We can control these extractions without risking sample or solvent evaporation. And we also can use the hydrophobic threads for long-term analyte stability. This kind of puts thread as an all-in-one substrate where we can do sample loading, storage, direct analysis, all on a piece of thread, and it can all be performed online, which is really exciting for us. With that, I want to give special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Abraham Badu-Tawia, Dr. Sierra Jackson, who just defended her PhD, my undergrads, Hannah and George, for helping me with a lot of this work, my lab in general, and Ohio State and ASMS for money and funding to conduct this project. I also want to thank you all for your time and attention. I hope this was interesting. If you have any questions for me, feel free to shoot me an email at this email address right here. You can also follow me or subscribe to my professional website and contact me on Twitter. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Samantha Teresa Mensah, and I am a PhD candidate at UCLA studying materials chemistry in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. Today I'm going to be talking about multiplexing aptamer field effect transistors for small molecule detection. Now, neurochemical monitoring started with the War of the Soups and the Sparks, where pharmacologists uncovered the first evidence that nerves communicate by releasing chemicals, or soups, such as acetylcholine. And neurophysiologists dismissed this evidence and remained committed to electrical communications, or sparks. Since then, we've learned that both are extremely important in brain function, communication, and pathology. Two of the most important and powerful tools we have to probe this are microdialysis and fast scan cyclic voltammetry. However, not both of these tools provide the necessary spatiotemporal selectivity and ability to sense more than one analyte at a time. So this is where other labs come in, such as methods that include optical and electrochemical forms of detection. The state of the art of neurochemical monitoring includes NIR CATs, or near IR catecholamine nanosensors from the Landry group at UC Berkeley, where they're able to image striatal dopamine using a non-genetically encoded near-infrared fluorescent nanosensor. This works by having a pristine single-walled carbon nanotube that is then functionalized with a material that makes it selective towards dopamine and norepinephrine, as you can see here. They are able to get signal changes for both dopamine and norepinephrine that were selective and didn't show cross-selectivity towards similarly structured molecules. Additionally, we have the electroenzymatic glutamate biosensor from the Montbouquet group at UCLA. There, they're able to functionalize a platinum wire with glucose oxidase and ascorbate oxidase using a cascading event of detection for specific towards glutamate. And they were able to get very low concentrations. Additionally, the electroenzymatic aptamer-based sensor up here for ATP is able to induce conformational change of a redox active labeled aptamer sequence with this quantitatively report with the quantitative report of the presence of target. Now, all of these methods are great for making in vivo, for making neurotransmitter measurements. However, the goal of our lab is to conduct in vivo neurotransmitter measurements, and this necessitates the building of a fast, small, sensitive, and selective sensor. Now, field effect transistors are a promising material because they're shown to be able to sense electronic changes within a certain distance of a semiconductor surface, beyond which is shielded. As you can see here, through the Debye length equation, the ionic strength of the buffer solution that the experiment is being conducted in actually makes it so that the Debye length is limited to less than a nanometer in full ionic strength buffers. So as you can see here, enzyme or immunofets are functionalized with a selective material. However, it's too large of a material to make those electronic changes near the surface of the semiconductor. So what we do instead is functionalize our field effect transistors with something called an aptamer, which is a short oligonucleotide sequence that is specific for an analyte of interest. So as you can see here, we're interested specifically in dopamine and serotonin. Now, what happens whenever this aptamer is exposed to dopamine or serotonin? It actually changes its conformational structure, and it changes the electronic environment at the surface of the semiconductor. These field effect transistors are made on a silicon wafer that has thermally etched SiO2 on it, followed by the semiconductor indium oxide, and then titanium and gold to act as the source and drain for the field effect transistor. From there, a current is ran through from the source to the drain, and changes in that transconductance are able to give us information on how much analyte is present. So using these mu sensors, we were able to show that we can have very high sensitivity and selectivity towards serotonin and dopamine. As you can see here on the top, the sensitivity for the analyte was really high. We tested this by using a scrambled dopamine aptamer, which was basically the same aptamer, only completely a random sequence. And that scrambled dopamine aptamer didn't have any response to dopamine, which proves that this response is a result of the specific sequence that were being used. We saw similar results for serotonin, and we also saw very, very low femtomolar limits of detection for both of these aptamers. Next, we wanted to test the selectivity of the aptamers against similarly structured molecules. So we saw that there were there was a high selection for the analyte and there was not a large response for the interfering molecules, which have similar structures and differ by only a single moiety in some cases. This was also significant because the previous aptamer that was selective for dopamine actually saw some cross-reactivity with norepinephrine. Dopamine and norepinephrine differ by only one hydroxy moiety. Here you can see that our sensors were not cross-selective for norepinephrine and did show high selectivity for dopamine. The next part of the characterization of these aptamers for neurotransmitters includes testing whether the secondary structure changes in solution when it's exposed to the analyte. We can do this by using circular dichroism spectroscopy. Circular dichroism spectroscopy works by testing out how far left or right a species will shift cross-polarized light. Here you can see that the dopamine aptamer shifted to the left and the serotonin aptamer shifted to the right. This suggests the formation of more parallel quadruplex structure-like and anti-parallel quadruplex structure-like, respectively. So specifically, my next role in this project is going to be figuring out how to multiplex our sensors and figuring out how to get different analytes for different aptamers for different analytes on parts of the sensor surface using advanced surface chemistries. I also plan to further characterize eight novel aptamers for serotonin and dopamine and characterize their on-FET performance. I plan to determine the aptamer surface density, which is an important question that we keep getting, so that can help us figure out the mechanism of response of our sensors, as well as multiplexing with a fluorescent aptamer so we can visualize the cross-reactivity of the functionalizations, and lastly, characterize the robustness and fouling effects of the sensors that we're making. The overall goal is to implement miniaturized and implantable probes with a reference aptamer that can be used to give an insight on any background noise that might be happening during the test. And with that, I'd like to thank both of my groups, the Ann Andrews group and the Paul Weiss group, as well as my committee members, Chong Liu and Andrea Casco. And I'd like to give special thanks to my funding sources, which is the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship and the NIH Chemistry Biology Interface Training Grant. And I'd like to thank you for listening. Hi, my name is Sammy Mensah. I am a co-founder and co-organizer of Black in Chem. I'm here today to talk a little bit about what our organization is and what happened during Black Chemists Week, as well as talk about what is Black in Chem X UCLA and what we're looking forward to in 2021. Black in Chem is part of a collective of organizations which are called collectively Black and X. This really started when a Black bird watcher, Christian Cooper, was racially profiled in Central Park while he was bird watching, starting the inaugural Black Birders Week. From there was a cascade of different weeks that were introduced, such as Black in Astro, Black in Neuro, and Black in Chem. Black in Chem is an organization that supports diversity in the chemical sciences, and we do this by highlighting and amplifying Black voices who face particular challenges in navigating the academic space. The inaugural Black Chemists Week occurred on August 10th through 15th, 2020, And really, it was a social media movement over Twitter where dozens of Black scientists and probably hundreds of allies united online discussing science, racism, policy, and how we can promote change within the field. The first event for Black Chemists Week was the Black and Chem Roll Call, which saw high engagements and participation and allowed its participants to highlight the work that they were doing and touch base with others over their love of chemistry. Here are 4 of the roll calls from members of our Black and Chem community. And as you can see, they were introducing themselves, giving background on themselves and their research, where they go to school and things like that. And this was just a fraction of the many Black and Chem roll call tweets that were put out that week. We also saw support from some big names in science and entertainment, such as MC Hammer and Michelle Williams and Nobel laureate Frances Arnold. What did this do for our community? It kind of validated what we were doing, that we were getting recognition on really large platforms, and it was the beginning of a cascade of coverage that we received on a national level, including articles from USA Today and Forbes and Nature. UCLA x Black and Chem is a campaign that was started that stemmed off of Black and Chem in 2020. We first set out by giving everybody a call to action. We talked about how many postdocs in the US were Black out of the approximately 1,300. And we talked about how many top chemistry professors are Black women out of the over 2,000 chemistry professors. And we saw patterns that it's very few, and we noticed that education can play a role in building racial equality and fair inclusion of Black voices. And we saw how Blacks have been historically excluded from academia and these spaces that we are now trying to navigate. And we saw an opportunity for us to make a change. So we set out to raise $100,000 to leave a 20-year legacy at UCLA. This would be funding for 2 specific goals. One is funding for fellowships for exemplary Black trainees. Studies have reported that without retention and inclusion efforts, recruitment efforts may actually not improve outcomes for Black trainees. A fellowship at UCLA improves retention rates for these Black students who are facing challenges that their counterparts may not necessarily have to face. Secondly, we also want to fund a lectureship for UCLA that would invite leading Black professors every year to come and highlight Black excellence in research, as well as communicate with our students and faculty. In 2021, Black and Chem has a lot of exciting things that we're looking forward to. First of all, we are very much looking forward to hosting a 2nd annual Black Chemist Week in August, as well as we have been looking forward to continuing our Black and Chem Journey seminar series, where we invite a prominent chemist to speak about their journey in chemistry. We have also been holding online socials, and we plan to become a registered charity as well as all of the nuances that come along with becoming a registered charity. We also are holding monthly Twitter takeovers and inviting people to take over our social media account for a week every month. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we are creating a network of support for Black chemists that can hopefully last beyond our tenure in Black and Chem. And I would really like to thank the team pictured here. The 7 of us have accomplished more than I've imagined we ever could together, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to be accomplishing next. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
That was a great talk, and thank you for the initiative about Black and Kim. We hope that it continues every year, and congratulations on forming Black and Kim. And congratulations on future doctoral success. I'm just gonna go ahead and throw that out there in the atmosphere. And of course, if it's live, Lord knows I'll be there. Just send us a Zoom link. Just like our next set of talent. Well, we will have some local Philly entertainers give us a performance that's to die for. And this amazing show and will be hosted on a Zoom link that you can find in the description below. And also, these drag performances are one of a kind, and we need to support our drag queens in these hard times because we can't attend live shows. So this is a phenomenal way to see an amazing amount of entertainment happen, and then a good way to kind of party and be happy about the success of the Black Queer Town Hall in STEM. And above all, before I get too ahead of myself and talk about all the science, we do need to talk about how this idea would not have been possible without the support of Black Queer Town Hall and everyone that works up under this umbrella with Bob the Drag Queen and Miss Peppermint. We ourselves would not have had any success if it was not for the original Black Queer Town Hall. And first, we would like to thank the people that are most important to this effort, which is Bob the Drag Queen and Miss Peppermint. We would like to thank Bob first because he is an amazing, tailored, specific person. He gives us exactly the information we need to know how to do it, and he's very specific with his time, and we really appreciate the professionalism that he taught us about. And next, we would like to thank Miss Peppermint. She is the brains behind everything. She has been giving us the how to, when to, how to do this, don't do it this way, and also just the fabulous conversation from time to time and the mentorship that we've received and how the entertainment business actually works. So it's actually been phenomenal to see how she was able to help us to progress in our progression as not only a scientist, but also future entertainers are providing a service for the larger community. So with that being said, I want to thank all of the speakers and the panelists for sharing their stories, insights, and incredible research. Above all, we hope that your research continues to make more therapeutic discoveries as well as potential new vaccines for various diseases. I also want to thank the organizers and sponsors for making this event possible. If any of our viewers want to reach out to any of the speakers over the past 3 days, send your questions to Black Queer Town Hall STEM. So in other words, BQTHSTEM@gmail.com. And we will direct those questions to them. Next, to end everything off, please do not log off. Link to the next Zoom link, okay? And enjoy the performance. And we would like to thank from the bottom of our hearts, both Ryan and I and myself. We're just so happy to be a part of this movement and to showcase what Black Queer STEM excellence looks like. And thank you. And we hope that you'll join us next year for the same level of excellence and maybe even more. So thank you for this day, and have an excellent opportunity to join in the conversation again by asking the person, did they see this when they can view it on YouTube? So we hope that you'll watch it again with your friends so that there's more views and you can tell other individuals about what science really looks like and how diverse it is. Thank you today for all the things that you've done.
Wow. Hello. We did it. Thank you so much for watching the Black Queer Town Hall STEM event. I hope you enjoyed the conversations, the panels. I want to say first off, thank you so much to our event organizers, to Ryan and AJ and the whole team, to UPenn, and to all of our sponsors. On behalf of Black Queer Town Hall, myself, Bob the Drag Queen, we are really appreciative that you allowed us to partner with you and all of the brilliant minds that you brought to the table. For those of you that are watching now, hopefully you caught the whole event, but if you missed any of it, you can always check out blackqueertownhall.com or our YouTube page, Black Queer Town Hall, for all of the extras and even some of the extra tidbits. There's a conversation that I had with Professor Dick Swab about gender and sexuality and whether or not we are born that way that I think that you might be interested in. And so if you want to hear more of that conversation, then you can check out our page we'll be releasing it next Friday. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. For more resources, please go to blackqueertownhall.com to find out a little bit more about some of the charities that we highlighted on our social media and more about our speakers and panelists. You all are amazing. Remember, Bob the Drag Queen and I started Black Queer Town Hall in an effort to foster community and education and celebration and joy and love, and give a platform to Black queer voices in light of everything that's been happening. And so we're going to continue to do that. And we want to give a very special thank you to the team at Virtue, who has been by our side, giving us guidance and expertise and professionalism. Thank you so much, Virtue. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed Black Queer Town Hall STEM event. I learned that science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are for everyone. And I hope that you feel the same way too. For now, I'm Peppermint, and I'll see you later.